Some news here in the United States. President Trump is poised to hand down the first veto of his presidency after the Senate approved the resolution to overturn his national emergency declaration on the border wall. Lawmakers in the Senate approved the rebuke of the president yesterday in a vote of 59 to 41. Before the vote, 9 Republicans had said they would support the measure, but that figure grew when Senators Marco Rubio, Roy Blunt, and Roger Wicker all got on board, raising the total number of Republicans voting in favor of the bill and against the president to 12. One Republican who did not end up voting yes, Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, who reversed course just minutes before the vote and stood by the president after previously expressing his support of the bill. Despite the increased Republican support to overturn the president's declaration, Senate Democrats still are short of the 67 votes that would be needed to override a veto by President Trump. It should also be noted that of the 22 Republican Senate seats up for grabs in 2020, all but Susan Collins of Maine stood with the president on this matter. Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee did vote to rebuke Trump, but he is not running for re-election next year. So, Jennifer Rubin, your reaction here, I saw some disappointment, not just from you and Noah, but other conservatives online, in people like Senator Ben Sasse and others who say they are constitutional conservatives here.
I am disappointed but not surprised. I think this is sort of peak supineness for the Republicans. This is what we have seen, which is the moral and intellectual corruption of the Republican Party, that people have really tossed whatever principles they had, whatever standards they had, and they will twist themselves like a pretzel to justify anything that will keep them in line with the president. And when you have someone like Ben Sasse, who clearly knows better, who writes books about character, about the Constitution, and he puts out really a sort of a pathetic written statement justifying weekly this vote. You know that that's just a corrupted soul. And what is the purpose, really, if you're going to sell your soul and remain in the Senate to literally consign your powers, consign your obligations to the executive branch? What really is the purpose? So on one hand, I suppose I'm pleased that you can find 12 souls there that are not beyond redemption. But it's pathetic that the rest of them should go down this road. And I think they will pay a political price. You have people like Cory Gardner. You have people like Thom Tillis, who really just made a fool of himself in this reversal, which is sort of mind-numbing. You have people like Joni Ernst. There are many people who are going to be on the ballot in 2020. Although no one vote, and perhaps a vote 18 months ahead of the election, is too much, I think the perception is that these people have been weak. They have capitulated. They have been enabled. And depending upon who the top of the ticket is, we could see some really tremendous numbers in the Senate for the Democrats as well.
No, the most interesting case to me is Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina. He wrote an op-ed on February 25th in the Washington Post. He gave a speech on the floor of the Senate explaining why they have to vote. Senators must vote. If you're a true conservative, you must vote to knock down this declaration of national emergency. He called himself a steward of the Article I branch to preserve the separation of powers, to curb the kind of executive overreach Congress has allowed to fester for the better part of the past century. I stood by that principle during the Obama administration, he wrote, and I stand by it now. And yet yesterday, he didn't put in his vote the way he'd been speaking and lecturing his colleagues.
Yeah, interesting is one word to say about this. The kind of craven capitulatory instinct that Jennifer was just talking about there is most evident in Senator Tillis. Is extremely disappointing. He talked about how intellectual honesty compelled him to take this very early stand against this national emergency, and then put out a statement yesterday in which nothing changed, in which Mike Lee put forward an attempt to create a consensus around changing these laws after the fact, and the president said no, and Mike Lee said, okay, I'm off ship. And a lot of other Republicans went with him. Thom Tillis moved. He said, well, okay, at least the president told me he would support an effort to amend the laws so that a future leftist president couldn't corrupt the Constitution in the manner that he has, and that satisfied me. You know, Ben Sasse's move here is disappointing, but if it's motivated by politics, at least it's motivated by politics. You can see that. There's, you know, he's up in 2020. Everybody, the only person who voted against this who is up in 2020 is Sue Collins. Everybody else said no. You can understand a politician being a politician as unsatisfactory as it is. lecturing us to this extent is absolutely distasteful.
Tom, by the way, we should point out, Danny, Tom Tillis heard the footsteps of a primary challenge as well within the last week, explicitly from people who said, I'm going to run against you if you vote against the president.
We sometimes forget that senators are human beings. Now, to understand, I wouldn't think anything else. These people, this is their livelihood. They make a couple $100,000 a year. This is their raison d'etre to have power. It's a process vote. And if most of us were I know everybody wants to think of themselves as heroes. If at the end of the day, your job, your livelihood, your family's well-being was on the line, and if I need to make a vote, at the end of the day, this is not a vote on Obamacare. This is not a vote on a issue. It's a process vote. Of course they're going to vote this way. We expect them to be superheroes.
Not of course, though.
Let me finish, guys. We can't.
12 of them
it wasn't a process.
Yeah, but they're not
either.
being primaried. Okay, you just in order for us to understand and just please let me finish. To understand and not be surprised and not sit intellectually and go, how could they do it? They're protecting their jobs as I believe
that's
95.
Okay,
but it's reality, and to think anything else, we're looking for superheroes that don't exist.
No,
I get
we're
that
not.
point,
There are
but I
12
get that
Republicans
point,
that
Donnie.
affect
Yeah, by the way, were any of them being primaried coming up? No.
No,
That's
no.
the difference,
But
obviously.
what you're describing is a rationalization, the notion that I can do more good on the inside than on the outside.
We shouldn't sit around and go, oh my God, how do we do
Just
it?
one point. I understand what you're saying, Donnie, but here's the thing. They made that with a man in Donald Trump that you can't trust him to keep his word. So why would you make that kind of deal with that kind of man, knowing you cannot trust
Because
him?
you lose
He
your
will
job
not be-
otherwise.
Well,
You
they
know,
made
John,
it
John,
anyway.
it's
So you
This is
stand
the
up on principle.
moral. This is the moral nihilism that has brought us to Donald Trump. The notion that, well, what do you expect? Politicians are going to be politicians? No. I mean, this is a complete loss of understanding and appreciation that these people are in national service. And my God, Ben Sasse can't go get a job someplace else. What a comment on that is. And you know what? There's some things you don't do to keep your job. You don't support people who are malicious. You don't support a candidate who's tearing down the Constitution.
Right.
Come on. We do expect more of these
Jennifer,
people.
let me-
And the fact there are 12 who did it should tell you something, and there are 13 in the House. All of them are going to be up on the
Jennifer, that's
election.
my point. Isn't it bizarre that the 12 brave people are not being primaried? So, and by the way, if those people being
believe
that's
me,
not the case.
That is the case other than Susan
I'm
Collins.
not heralding them. I am saying that the rest of them don't deserve to be in office. I think we have to raise our standards. And the way we got Donald Trump was thinking like this, thinking, well, they're all craven. This guy at least is my bully. He's my liar. He's my cheat. And we cannot think that way. We have to raise our sights. We have to recover some value system to our democracy. And I will rail until my last breath against a rationalization that says, well, they're just keeping their jobs.
It's not.
That is wrong.
You're not defending it. You're
I'm
explaining it.
not telling you not to rail. Obviously, we all have the same similar moral compass. I'm telling you, in order for us to properly analyze and try and fix and try and understand, you have to not take away the basic human reality and not be naive and not think that the Democrats would have done the same thing in
I'm
a
not
process vote
naive.
like that.
I'm not
and it's
naive.
not going to change. It's human beings not going to change.
No,
That's
I'm
it.
not naive. I'm saying that we shouldn't accept that. That's unacceptable. Of course they're craven. Of course they're
really quickly.
desirous of their
Go ahead,
jobs.
Eddie.
Really quickly, Donnie, part of what you've just described is one of the reasons why we're in the mess we're in today. So we tend to exceptionalize Donald Trump. He's the evil avatar, right, who's doing all of this thing, all of the bad things to our democracy. And what we've been saying for the last 2 years is that Donald Trump is just the tip of the iceberg, that there are a whole host of other behaviors and actions that are complicit in bringing us to this crisis point. And one of the ways, and one aspect or one characteristic or one set of choices is that people are selfish, that they're self-interested, that they don't give a damn about anything but themselves. And so here we are in a moment where the Congress is facing, in effect, an exercise of imperial power where the executive branch is intruding on the role of the Congress. And you have folk who are concerned, I understand what you're saying, folk who are concerned about their jobs. They become, to me, the poster child of what's wrong with us. It's not just Trump. It's all of those folk, too, who are complicit.
We shouldn't
Yes.
lose sight of the big picture here, however, though. We're talking
That
about
was
the
the big
41 who
picture.
voted against. It's a very big picture.
Okay.
The 41 who voted against it are important. The 59 who voted for this measure are what matters. What is before the courts now is
Yes.
the litigation of the case that the president is claiming he has the authority delegated to him by Congress. Congress has explicitly said
Twice.
absolutely not.
Right.
That's going to be very relevant when the court begins to decide these issues.
Here are the 12 Republicans who supported the resolution. Jerry Moran of Kansas, Roy Blunt of Missouri, Susan Collins of Maine, Mike Lee of Utah, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Rob Portman of Ohio, Mitt Romney of Utah, Marco Rubio of Florida, Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, Rand Paul of Kentucky, Roger Wicker of Mississippi, and Lamar Alexander of Tennessee. Those are the 12 Republicans who voted in support of the resolution. President Trump has promised in all caps on Twitter to veto this as soon as he gets the chance.
Quickly, before we go, just let's give a W to Donald Trump on this. He is so brilliant. I can't stand him, but he's so brilliant. Basically, at the end of the day, okay, this is going to go to the Supreme Court. He gets to say in the next election, I'm not giving up. Even though he gets to run against the Republicans. You know what? I'm the only guy that pounds my fist and is strong. He used the word strong yesterday. I salute those strong Republicans. It doesn't matter. It'll go to the Supreme Court. It doesn't matter. It gets shot down. It's a win for him. That's the mad genius of this disgusting, vile human
I
being.
happen to agree because he is thrilled to be able to use that veto right now. It's the first time he's taking it out, and he's taking it out in his spin world to build the wall. He is willing to do everything for security. So in Donald Trump world, I agree. It is a win for him.
All right, we're going to continue this conversation in a moment. I always enjoy a good pile on Donnie. It's a good way to start a Friday morning. Coming up in a new interview, President Trump appeared to issue a warning to his political opponents that his supporters could turn violent if they choose to. We'll explain that. Plus, we're joined by New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio, who's been an outspoken voice on gun reform. We'll talk about that issue and much more with the New York Democrats straight ahead. But first, we go live to Iowa, where the 2020 presidential hopefuls are flooding the zone. Among them, Beto O'Rourke, who you may have heard got into the race yesterday. What President Trump said about O'Rourke's rollout next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.